IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Today's episode, we're going to talk about nukes like we have in the past, but it's a special episode because I have with us some very special guests. We have Professor Keir Leiber and Professor Daryl Press. And if you don't know about them, well, they're kind of rock stars in this field in that they make these wonderful arguments about counterforce, which get a lot of attention. But I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to ask both of you, Professor Leiber, Professor Press. You know, you've been making this broad argument for some years now, and can you just tell us how you came about it and what's it all about? If you can start.
Sure. This is Keir Leiber speaking. I think the key thing is that Daryl and I came up in this business at roughly the same time, entering graduate school a few years after the end of the Cold War, at a time when nuclear weapons were seen as largely irrelevant or receding in importance in international politics. And at the same time, we learned everything we knew about nuclear deterrence from the literature in the Cold War, which largely held that after mutual assured destruction came into place, that a lot of the interesting questions of nuclear strategy were no longer important. And I think I speak for Daryl when I say this, that even at the time, we realized that there was kind of a problem here, that especially in the academy, but in the analytical community in general, people did not seem to be paying attention to issues of nuclear strategy, certainly the nuclear balance of power, nuclear capabilities, as if they mattered for policy, and for academic debates. And the further we studied these issues, the more we were convinced at the utter importance for students and analysts and policymakers to revisit supposed truths of the nuclear age.
Yeah, I think that's right. This is Daryl. I think Keir and I together stumbled upon two puzzles fairly early on in our work together on nuclear weapons. And we've essentially been exploring these two puzzles ever since. Puzzle number one was that sometime around the end of the Cold War, there were a variety of technological changes that occurred that seemed to overturn all the truths about nuclear weapons, namely that nuclear wars could never be won, that nuclear weapons were inherently secure to disarming attacks. And what Keir and I discovered is that all the mathematical models which during the Cold War showed that to be true, were suddenly showing the opposite. And so we wanted to explore whether the models were wrong or whether the models were right and the world had just changed. The second puzzle we discovered was that the world was not behaving the way that the most important theories of international politics in the nuclear age predicted. The theory of the nuclear revolution basically claims that for the past 75 years, states should have been acting like their fundamental security was assured, and yet they haven't been doing so. Countries have been acting like they face threats in all parts of the world, that they need alliances, they need to arms race. And so Keir and I have been trying to understand, why is it that countries don't seem to be behaving the way that prominent academic theorists of international relations and nuclear weapons have been predicting?
Right. So if I were to caricature the 90s, first, people thought nukes didn't matter. Second, people didn't think the number of nukes or the types of nukes you had didn't matter. And three, at the same time, there were people who believed that basically nukes brought about some sort of end of history, right? States would stop competing in the old ways and everything would be wonderful. And none of those played out. And I think fourthly, maybe it's also the changing technology. So what drove you to focus on changing technology and what impact it had on nuclear deterrence?
Well, again, this is Keir. There was also the focus on terrorism, of course, after after 9/11. But if you stood back in 2002 and looked at nuclear debates, it was either about terrorism or about proliferation or about accidents, unauthorized use, sort of all of these anything but traditional issues of capabilities, strategy, technology. And so, again, we didn't set out to investigate the technological dimensions of nuclear politics, but the dominant theory at the time held that this particular technology was going to should have a transformational effect on international politics. It clearly had not had that effect, which is why prominent scholars like Robert Jervis and Kenneth Waltz spent so much time trying to explain why the world didn't look the way their theory should look. But it occurred to Daryl and to me that maybe the problem was with the theory itself. And so we really wanted to understand, how does technology impact the nuclear equation? And as I said, that led us down a number of different roads, one of which is in particular about the advances in technology that have facilitated or improved counterforce targeting, which in turn undermines arsenal vulnerability, which can lead to all kinds of dynamics in international security competition.
I'd say that there have been three strands of arguments that Keir and I have worked on with regard to nuclear weapons. Strand number one is about technology, and it basically makes the claim that technology has been changing in a variety of ways, all linked to the computer revolution, which make nuclear arsenals all around the world more vulnerable than they were in the past, and therefore weaken deterrence. That argument basically is revolutions in accuracy, revolutions in remote sensing mean that countries can now do what they only dreamed of being able to do throughout the Cold War, which is locate each other's nuclear weapons and destroy them with a first strike, undermining deterrence. That's one strand of argument that Keir and I have been investigating. I'll tell you the truth. We were stunned when we stumbled upon this. We didn't expect to find that. But that's what we found in that initial End of Mad article, and then we've developed it and generalized it with the new era of Counterforce. That's strand one. Strand two is you often hear people say, look, the problem with nuclear war is the problem of irrationality or the problem of accident. Nobody with their right mind will ever use nuclear weapons intentionally in war. And what Keir and I have realized, and it's lying in plain sight, is that that's never how countries have thought about nuclear weapons, and that in fact there are rational reasons for countries to use nuclear weapons, even against nuclear-armed countries in the midst of conventional wars. Namely, weak countries who are losing conventional wars have an incentive to use nuclear weapons coercively to get their stronger adversaries to stop. That was NATO's strategy during the Cold War. It's Pakistan and North Korea's strategy today. In some ways, it's Israel's strategy. In some ways, it's Russia's strategy. And to some extent, all of us in the nuclear business understand that, but we lose sight of it when we say things and think things like Pakistan would never rationally use nuclear weapons against India, or North Korea would never rationally use nuclear weapons against the United States. They would if the United States or India pushed them too far in a conventional war. And we've had a whole strand of our research that was investigating those dynamics. The third strand has essentially been pulling this all together to try to answer the puzzle that Keir just talked about a moment ago. Namely, why is it that the predictions of the nuclear revolution, advanced by such giants of IR as Bernard Brodie and Kenneth Waltz and Bob Jervis, why have those predictions not been borne out? Why have nuclear weapons not allowed countries to relax? And our answer is linked to some of these things we just talked about. Namely, it's true that nuclear weapons are the ultimate instruments of stalemate. However, creating stalemate with nuclear weapons is difficult, and it's a competitive process, and it involves actually creating truly survivable, secure retaliatory forces. And furthermore, once you get yourself into stalemate, you still have the problem that adversaries might try to get you back out of stalemate. And so competition continues in the nuclear age, not because leaders are ill-informed as Waltz and Jervis would have you believe, but because countries understand that stalemate is difficult and stalemate is reversible.
So I would like to go back to the first strand of the argument, where you say that because of the technology revolution, arsenals are becoming more vulnerable. However, one might argue, and one might really say that, look at China. China is hiding their arsenal in tunnels within their cities. So how do you explain that the technology revolution allows the United States or some other country to successfully detect these weapons and successfully target them?
Yeah, I mean, countries around the world take steps to try to reduce the vulnerability of their forces. And China uses tunneling, and China uses decoys and subterfuge, just like essentially every country with nuclear weapons does. Those are all things they could do before the remote sensing revolution, before the guidance revolution. The various steps that countries take to protect their nuclear weapons still have some effectiveness, but the playing field has shifted. Whereas 25 years ago, the United States had much more limited means to detect all these tunnel openings and to track mobile launchers that are moving on roads. We now have many more means of doing so. And so the way I would like to think about it, and the way Keir does, is it is still possible to deploy a secure retaliatory force, whether through tunnels and underground railways, whether through submarines, through a variety of means, mobile land-based missiles. But it's a lot harder if you're a mobile missile commander today than it was 20 years ago. And it's likely to get harder in the future.
But why is it getting harder? Can you elaborate on how these specific technologies make it harder?
Sure, yeah, we can do that. But before I answer that question, though, just take a step back and understand what we're saying about nuclear weapons is that they shouldn't be taken and placed in a separate category, a revolutionary category where the traditional means of strategic analysis no longer apply. I mean, we would never talk about the conventional world and say, here's this conventional capability, now the game of international politics is over. We would never look at a weapons development in the conventional realm and say that this produces automatic deterrence. There's nothing automatic about deterrence, as Wohlstetter said many, many years ago. And we're simply returning to that kind of view of this. We're not trying to normalize or rationalize nuclear use. We're simply applying traditional means of strategic analysis to maybe the most important category. In terms of specific technological developments that have undermined arsenal vulnerability, we look at two major advances, both driven by the computer revolution. And the first is in accuracy improvements, accuracy of weapon systems, and the second is in improvements in remote sensing. If you take another step back and think about how states protect their arsenals, there are three strategies: hardening forces, concealing forces, and producing more of those forces. Okay, and advances in accuracy have undermined hardening as a strategy. Advances in remote sensing have undermined concealment as a strategy. And to some extent, arms reductions in the numbers of nuclear weapons is undermining the third strategy of redundancy.
All right. Now, I'm going to try and attempt to summarize your argument again, and I'm going to try and push back. So what you're saying is that if a weak state, say North Korea, were to use nuclear weapons coercively, what a stronger state like the United States could do is use counterforce capabilities to destroy the North Korean arsenal, correct?
It might be one of the options.
All right. Yeah. So what you're saying is that option is now increasingly available.
Yeah. Again, understand, I know I'm happy to talk about the United States and North Korea in particular, but what Daryl and I would really emphasize is that these are global trends.
Sure.
And so all countries' nuclear arsenals are, in theory, becoming more vulnerable in the face of advances in accuracy and remote sensing. Clearly, if you are the United States, if you are a very sophisticated adversary, or you're facing a very sophisticated adversary, your calculations and your concerns will be very different. In the case of North Korea, one of the reasons that North Korea would face tremendous incentives to escalate to nuclear use in a conventional war is because the alternative of doing nothing and continuing to fight at the conventional level will lead to catastrophic defeat and consequences for the North Korean regime. And escalation, which is not all-out escalation, but somewhere on the ladder, ranging from a detonation on their own territory to detonation over the Sea of Japan, to hitting a military target, etc., is compelling because it leaves the United States with very few good options, ranging from accepting a ceasefire and agreeing to halt the conflict that keeps the North Korean regime in place, to a punitive strike against Pyongyang that would kill millions of people but also potentially destroy the regime, to counterforce. And that could be conventional counterforce, nuclear counterforce. And just so we're not too caught up in the lingo here, we're simply talking about the United States going after the nuclear delivery systems that could be used in future escalation. So that would be one option. And of course, nature of technology at a given time either makes that more or less feasible.
All right. Now, I'm sure that you've heard this argument before, but people will tell you, well, remember the Scud hunt of 91. Remember 2006 getting those Hezbollah launchers. What do you say to that?
So I think there's a lot different in the U.S.-North Korea situation than the Scud hunt of 91. Partly it's the time that's elapsed since 91 and the technological improvements there. But in some ways, the more significant difference is the 91 Scud hunt was a war in which the United States was fighting against a country who it hadn't really focused on very much for the previous 20 years. The United States had not, used a variety of sensors to essentially map, kind of all the firing spots in the western Iraqi desert. And so the war was basically kind of fought with about 6 to 9 months warning. With regard to North Korea, the United States and South Korea have been staring at North Korea and the North Korea's nuclear development sites, North Korea's missile garrisons, the road networks, the gradient on the various roads to determine which of these roads are appropriate for using TELs. I would suspect that I don't know that we monitor things like the snow removal patterns on various roads. Which roads do the cash-strapped North Korean regime insist are cleared and which do they not? The United States and South Korea have been focusing on North Korea for decades with increasingly effective and increasingly intrusive surveillance techniques. So counterforce is never going to be – no military operation is ever perfect. No capabilities are perfect. There's always a back and forth. But the fact that the United States was not able to effectively hunt Iraq's mobile missile launchers in 91, I don't think is determinative about a campaign now. The last thing I'd just kind of point out is if, God forbid, you get into the situation Keir just described, a conventional war on the Korean Peninsula in which North Korea begins to use nuclear weapons, every weapon in the U.S. arsenal is at least under consideration. So some of the Scud hunting, no-dong hunting, would be done with conventional weapons, but some of it might be done with nuclear weapons, and that also gives you a bit more play in terms of target location uncertainty. And so it's just a very different scenario.
How would ballistic missile defense fit into this? Because I'm assuming you won't get every single nuke, right? So
yeah, it's part of this kind of counterforce story. And then let me kind of clarify that Keir's and my ultimate point here is not about advocating any particular policy. One can hear what we're saying and favor the United States developing good counterforce capabilities to help protect its allies, or one can hear everything we're saying and think this is a terrible idea and the United States shouldn't build these. Our principal message here is to explain to people that the world has changed, that it used to be that if you have a medium-sized nuclear arsenal, it's essentially going to be invulnerable. And the reality is that's no longer the case. What one takes from that, whether one thinks this is good news or bad news, whether one thinks that a country like the United States or India, who faces weaker countries who have nuclear weapons, should be pushing in this direction or not, that's up to you. But we're just trying to say the job for the weak state who's trying to hide their nuclear forces is getting a whole lot harder.
Yeah, and actually just to pick up on what Daryl said, but in a way that also addresses your question about ballistic missile defense, again, we're taking the world the way it is and trying to do objective analysis of strategic conditions. And the United States can say all it wants that missile defense is not geared at country A and instead it's only geared at country B, or missile defense is only useful for situation A but not for B. But the fact of the matter is it's about a capability. And if ballistic missile defense is useful in small numbers against for example, could ballistic missile defense be useful as a mop-up against any surviving missiles, warheads that would be there after a attempted disarming strike by the United States? Yes. Would it be useful against a a full launching of all Chinese ballistic missiles or a Russian, retaliatory strike that included the majority of its force? Of course not.
So I want to talk about something that you guys haven't explored, but I would like to ask your opinion about it, is you now have private companies that offer satellite services which are fairly accurate in detecting objects. So for a country like North Korea or Pakistan, if they were able to purchase this off-the-shelf service, how much of an advantage do you think they would have in their counterforce capabilities? And is this a revolution in private space industry itself, a revolution that would probably entangle with the nuclear realm?
This is a perfect example of the way technology is changing things. I guess I would say is, yes, getting commercial satellite photos, lots and lots of them, of the same facility, can teach countries all kinds of things about the location of forces and the peacetime operations and which ones are in what facilities at what times. There are all kinds of things you could learn. If you compare that to the kind of data that the most sophisticated countries in the world who are pursuing these capabilities are acquiring, though, that one thing, the commercial satellite photos, is a tiny piece of the puzzle. So, for example, if you're the United States, hypothetically, trying to gather information on North Korean counterforce targets, which is a bigger target set than simply weapon systems, what you would be doing on a day-to-day basis is, sure, taking lots of satellite photos of whatever facilities you can observe. You'd also be using spectroscopy to try to capture any sort of indications of what's inside of facilities. You'd also be trying to do all kinds of clever things to try to track individuals and their movements who you think are associated with various forces. You'd also be putting unattended ground sensors hidden by various road junctures to see when a truck of a certain sound signature comes down this road, does it 70% of the time turn right or 70% of the time turn left? You'd be gathering all this data. You'd be gathering ELINT emissions. You'd be gathering SIGINT. You'd be putting together this entire picture. Can another country buy bits and pieces of this commercially? Yes. Would it help them? Yes. But it pales in comparison to what the well-funded intelligence services of many countries are doing on a daily basis.
So what I gather is that you could buy the piece of the puzzle, but buying absolute counterforce capability is still extremely expensive.
No. I guess what I would say is that for a country like Pakistan or North Korea to purchase on the free market, pieces of the remote sensing puzzle that might be helpful for a counterforce is not helpful for them, in the sense that their challenge is not to do counterforce against their adversaries. Their challenge is to avoid a disarming counterforce strike, and therefore the solution would not be to get nice pictures of their own against U.S. capabilities, but instead to take out U.S. capabilities in space that are providing the United States with remote sensing information that would be useful for a disarming attack. So I think the implication is that space-based assets space is a domain that is likely to see competition given in this new era of counterforce.
And you talked about space. What about under the sea? I mean, everybody's always assumed your boomer is safe, right?
Yeah,
but it's not quite true.
Yeah, this is an area where Daryl and I, it's such a fascinating area. It's also highly classified. Neither Daryl or I are approaching this from a classified perspective, but there's just a lot we don't know about advances in technology in this area. But what we're struck by is the number of times that people have just simply asserted that keeping a large metal tube hidden in the oceans or seas is something that will be the case for all of eternity or far into the future. And again, these dramatic improvements in remote sensing, where we can literally stare back in time to almost the Big Bang. We can stare into space, and what we're going to have difficulty, finding large objects in the water. Again, this is still a major challenge. We are not suggesting that submarine-based nuclear delivery systems are all of a sudden vulnerable. But this is an area where technology is progressing at a rapid clip. And on top of that, what we now know about the Cold War should lead us to question our faith in the ability of countries to deploy systems that can't be found.
Yeah, because at one point, Soviet Union's submarines could be detected. And I think there's a very nice book called The Blind Man's Bluff.
Sure.
Which sort of tells you about the whole story of how we were able to detect the Soviet submarines and how they were almost close to collision.
Sure. And what Daryl's points earlier about the intelligence preparation of the battlefield applied to ASW in the Cold War and the ability to track Soviet subs leaving port, understand their deterrent patrols, hydrophones all over, exploitation of the deep sound channel. It's extraordinary what we're learning now about a time period that we thought was a period of invulnerability.
When I was at MIT in the mid-1990s.
Wow, you're old.
I remember I went to a conference, and it was a conference that was basically kind of American academics and arms controllers on one hand, and kind of Russian technical experts kind of from the Russian arms control community on the other hand. And they were talking about, in the post-Cold War world, were there ways we could structure our nuclear forces and nuclear relationships to reduce the risk of accidents and misperception and such. And there was this dramatic exchange where the American arms controller types kept saying, well, why don't we do things like get rid of our ICBMs and move to all submarine forces, and it would make everybody secure and everybody safe, and et cetera. And one of the friendly Russian arms controller types, at some point in my memory, he was basically shouting, said, why is it every time I come to America, my good friends tell me how we would all be safer if we put all our nuclear weapons on submarines. And when I go back to Russia, I'm told we can't get the Americans to get their damn submarines out of our ports. So my point is that there is a giant gap between the conventional viewpoint, even among deterrence experts, about the inherent security of submarines on one hand, and the reality, which is in some circumstances, submarines are very secure, and in some circumstances, they're not. And the biggest problem here is in many cases, you cannot tell which of those two worlds you're in.
Just go to numbers. So what seems to be really strong about your argument is that you talk about hardening, concealment, and numbers. This is the three ways in which you can help an arsenal survive. And to me, each of these seems to follow just one strategy, right? So if you harden, it's no secret where your silo is. The only problem to solve is penetrating that silo and destroying your missile. If you conceal, it's physically vulnerable. You just need to know where it is. And to me, those seem to be hard problems, but not necessarily unsolvable, which leaves us with numbers. And what does that mean for arms control? If safety is only in numbers, should we just say bye to arms reduction?
Well, if we're being honest, I think we would not be alone in suggesting that the future of nuclear arms control in the form of reductions looks pretty bleak today. And I think it's not a coincidence. I think the increased vulnerability of existing forces leads countries to understand that all three legs of the strategy of survivability, hardening, concealment, and redundancy are important. And so countries are going to be enormously reluctant to reduce numbers. Where is that point? What threshold of numbers? Again, it depends on the context, depends on the others. Just note, by the way, that the strategies of survivability, there are trade-offs to each. You want to send mobile forces out into the countryside or subs at sea. Those are incredibly vulnerable if they can be found. The benefits of fixed targets, you can harden them, but everybody knows where they are. So all these things work together. And again, I think the future of nuclear arms control is looking pretty bleak.
I'd add, that's I think well said. I'd add two things to this. One of them is just kind of emphasize that for most of the Cold War, force numbers on both the sides of the Soviet Union and the United States were so very high that I think the arms control community was largely correct in thinking that you could have the same amount of secure retaliatory capability on both sides, but just at much smaller numbers. And you'd at minimum save money, and maybe by making force cuts, you'd also trigger kind of a thaw in relations. I think they were right. But to be provocative, it's possible that the arms control community fell in love with the means and lost sight of the objectives, meaning that they continue to pursue the same policy of reductions without actually going back and doing the math and asking, is it really true given innovations in sensing and targeting, that lower numbers are just as secure as higher numbers, given where we are now. And I'm not at all convinced that they are. If you believe in deterrence, if you're favoring peace, you can make a case for a world without nuclear weapons. You can make a case with a world with nuclear weapons. But making the case for a world with nuclear weapons, but smaller arsenals, might be the worst of all worlds. Let me just add one last thing, which is the entire arms reduction theory was also based in a world in which the only thing really that could destroy a nuclear weapon was another nuclear weapon. And therefore, when you made a reciprocal arms reduction, you were eliminating targets that had to be destroyed in order to disarm someone, which was bad for peace, but you were also destroying or eliminating the weapons that could do the attacking, and that was good for peace. But in a world in which conventional weapons are getting unprecedented ability to destroy nuclear weapons, nuclear arms cuts essentially destroy or eliminate the targets that must be destroyed, but don't actually limit the things that can do the hunting. And so it might be inherently destabilizing at this point.
So we have two very interesting trends going on. The first one is that you have the technology revolution and you have technology taking the precedence over everything else. Second, you have arms control dying. The traditional forms of arms control where the focus is on reductions, that's dying. But at the same time, we also have threats from cyber capabilities. And as Professor Keir mentioned, we also have threats from space-based weapons, which could be an area of competition. So according to you, how do you think we should think about arms control in the future?
The fact is, if quantitative reductions seem infeasible moving forward, that leaves something else, which is qualitative arms control. And to take your comparison, perhaps there's ways to control the technology that's emerging, whether it's cyber or in traditional realms of accuracy or remote sensing. But unfortunately, that looks even bleaker than the idea of quantitative reductions. Look, the fact of the matter is the advances that we identify as contributing to a new era of counterforce are advances that are occurring worldwide as part of global development. I mean, what it means to be an advanced society is to have remote sensing capabilities, whether for scientific research purposes, to look back in time, to peer into your brain, to look into the soft tissue in your body for medical purposes, et cetera. And accuracy is relevant in the conventional realm, not just the nuclear realm, and is not very subject to something like a verifiable treaty. What are you going to do? Get inside each other's systems to examine their accuracy? There's not an accuracy a button inside a weapon that you can control. It doesn't work that way. You would need to borrow a whole ton of your adversary's forces, test them out on the battlefield, figure out where accuracy lies. So again, I'm quite pessimistic about the ability to limit the key technological sources of this new era of nuclear vulnerability.
Keir just depressed me. I think Keir's and my message is not so bleak, actually. The first thing to remember about nuclear weapons is that they're the greatest instrument of stalemate ever invented. Nuclear weapons do a fine job preventing wars. The second thing to remember about nuclear weapons is if we screw up deterrence and we get it wrong, we're going to have a catastrophe. And so the fundamental question about nuclear weapons and deterrence should not be about can we save money here? Can we reduce the arsenal there? Can we send a symbol toward of our commitment towards some abstract goal with this step or that step? Nuclear deterrence might bring great peace to the world. Our responsibility as nuclear powers is to do it in a responsible way that maximizes their deterrent effect. And what that means is, first and foremost, building and retaining secure retaliatory forces, not doing so at minimal force levels, but at substantial and robust force levels, so that in peacetime, in crisis, and even in the midst of conventional wars, both sides understand that there is no profit from trying to disarm the other. If we do that, we can essentially get most of the benefit of nuclear weapons, their powerful deterrent capability, and minimize the possibility of catastrophe. And ultimately, that's what we owe our populations. That's what we owe the world. And it does lead to a better world than, frankly, the world without nuclear weapons. Here's another way of saying it, which is there are lots of policies where we should basically do just enough, right? Where you're trying to optimize, right? The right amount of healthcare to mostly have your population healthy and to have good access to healthcare without bankrupting your country, right? You try to optimize the speed limit to get people places efficiently while not preventing every accident, but not having too many accidents. Nuclear deterrence is not a policy where anybody should be trying to optimize. You should never try to have just enough. And none of us should be trying to posture on the international stage by making arms reductions. Any country who's accepting the risks to humanity by having nuclear weapons owes it to themselves and owes it to humanity to take the business of deterrence seriously. And that means build enough nuclear weapons and posture them in a fashion that it is impossible for an enemy on a very angry day, in a bout of irrationality, to imagine a way to defeat them in a nuclear war. That's what should be driving India's and the United States's and, frankly, Pakistan's and Russia's and China's nuclear policy. Not to have just enough nuclear capability, but to ensure that their forces are an effective deterrent and not a tempting target.
So before we conclude, I want to ask you, Professor Leiber, India has this no first use policy. Does it make sense for India to have this policy, given that, some people are claiming India is developing counterforce capabilities and so on?
I think the question is largely irrelevant, what India's declaratory policy is. The only benefits I can think are to signal to different audiences, maybe to signal to the international audience that India sees nuclear weapons as, as a regrettable capability. Maybe it's signaling to domestic audiences that India doesn't need to build certain kinds of forces. But I think the most compelling argument for no first use would be something to the effect of it's an effort to avoid instability in a relationship with an adversary, and that if you and your adversary can take steps to de-alert forces, to eliminate preemptive strike incentives, then perhaps a no first use policy would make sense. The big problem here is that India's most likely potential adversary, Pakistan, has zero interest in a no first use policy. In fact, the strategic rationale is strongly in favor of first use. That is Pakistan's ability to threaten first use of nuclear weapons to deter Indian conventional attack. It takes two to tango, and at best you have one country here that has a no first use policy, and I would argue it's basically irrelevant for whatever India would do in an actual conflict.
Wonderful. On that note, thank you so much, Professor Leiber. Thank you so much, Professor Press.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Look! Up in the internet! It's a meme! No! It's a cat video! No! It's the Geek Fruit Podcast!
That's right, we interrupt this riveting broadcast to tell you about our show, The Geek Fruit Podcast, where Tejas, Dinkar, and I, Jishnu, talk about everything in pop culture, including DC, Marvel, Star Wars, Netflix, and everything in between.
You know how your friends hate it when you ramble about some nerdy crap and you just want somebody to listen to you? Well, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that, but come listen to us ramble and it'll almost be like the real thing. Kind of.
Listen to new episodes of the Geek Fruit Podcast every Monday and the Geek Fruit Bulletin every Thursday on iTunes, Google Podcasts, the IVM app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Happy listening, you nerds.